Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here today with a face I think familiar to many in our YogaU community, Leslie Howard. Leslie is a yoga therapist, an experienced yoga teacher with more than 20 years of teaching experience, but she's also a licensed massage therapist, skilled in therapies such as cranial sacral work and Maya abdominal therapy, and other specialties as well. But why you're probably familiar with her is the specialization that she has spent a lot of time on, and that's the pelvic floor, and especially in yoga practice. Leslie has helped clients and students through pregnancy, postpartum health, menopause, incontinence issues, prolapse organs, sexual pelvic pain, and more. And although her work is largely with women, she's also works with men who have pelvic floor issues such as prostate issues or recovery from prostate cancer. She does workshops and trainings worldwide and has written a book about caring for the female pelvis called Pelvic Liberation. So Leslie, as I'm reading through that list, it's quite a list of things you help people with that are probably sometimes at their most vulnerable.
Yes.
So now I think because you have spent so many years with the pelvic floor, that there are some common misconceptions that drive me a little bit crazy, but they must drive you insane. And so I'm going to just talk to you about two of them, and then I'm going to just let you speak.
Okay.
The first one is that any problem with the pelvic floor, especially something like incontinence, is because it's not strong enough and it needs Kegels. And a lot of people understand Kegels to be squeezing everything, south of the border, just squeeze and hold on for dear life, which I think causes more problems. So the first one is that the biggest pelvic floor issue is lack of strength. The second one is that the pelvic floor exists as this island unto itself. And when you're working with the pelvic floor, that's all you're working with. And you're working with the saddle or this hammock that just free flowing in the body, and not this completely really complicated set of muscles, tissue, fascia, all of that other stuff. So I realize this is the core of your life's work. So to ask you to say briefly a few things about it.
Yeah. Well, you've given me two questions to launch from. So, okay, so the first one about everybody's pelvic floor is weak. That actually is usually true. Okay, so but what we think of as weak in a muscular when we're talking about muscles is we think laxity, like, oh, your biceps are weak, therefore you need to do more bicep curls, right? So if your pelvic floor is weak, that it may be the case that your muscles are lacking tone and they do need to be exercised just like a bicep. But what is really, really common, and it's getting better. I think there's more awareness of it. I mean, I know there is. But what's really common is that a lot of, I'm going to say women, because I mostly work with women, have their muscles are too tight, and we don't think of tight as weak. We think of, oh, I want to tighten my abs because bathing suit weather's coming, or I want to tighten my butt because they look better in my jeans when they're tight. So we use this word tight as a word for tone, and they really are very different things. So when a muscle is in a shortened position and tight, it doesn't have its full range of motion. And so, like, if my bicep was really short and tight, my arm would be stuck in this position, right? So for me to do a bicep curl, the first thing I have to do is try to get that muscle to release. So it's the same thing with the pelvic floor. If the pelvic floor is very tight and a doctor a well-intentioned doctor tells you, you got to do your Kegels, that may or may not help you for many reasons. One is you might be dealing with too much tension already. And it's not that you don't want to eventually do those, but it might not be the first thing you start with. That's one thing. The other thing is I've been to a number of doctors before I knew what I know, and they would say, do your Kegels, and I'd be like, okay. And there was like never a discussion of what they were, how do you do them? Are you doing them correctly? And as you said, squeezing everything, I call it squeezing everything below the navel, hoping for the best. So, that isn't productive either, because our awareness, many people's awareness has been cut off from this area. And so in my workshops, I see a lot of people going, I never noticed my right side doesn't turn on at all, because they've just not tuned in. But if you aren't taught to tune in, or told or suggested to tune in, and your doctor just says squeeze the day away, well, you might be squeezing that left side that works and the right side's not working. And so that's why I'm not anti-Kegel. I'm just I'm up for a little more nuance than that, and that it's not a panacea that will solve all problems. So did I cover the first question?
You
Did
did, and I
cover-
love the word nuance there, because I think that's what gets missed, that this is really a complicated, it's not so simple, right?
It's not, and I don't want that to sound daunting, but can you invest a little bit of time into learning this? And then you don't have to, once you re-educate your body, let me tell you, your pelvic floor, you came into this world, your pelvic floor worked. It worked, it knew what to do. But then, you pile this thing called life on, you've got, athletics, accidents, surgeries, babies. I mean, there's so many things that can affect the tone and health of your pelvic floor. So, it's in there, it's in the neural pathways of how it's supposed to work, but we've forgotten. And it's much easier to teach yourself something you already have learned a while ago, or that but you've
Yeah,
forgotten, than to
yes.
teach something absolutely brand new. So it doesn't take
Yeah.
that long, a little bit of investment in time. And if you really want to get nuanced, you can go deeper and deeper. And of course, with yoga, that's what we're all about, is peeling back the layers. It's like, okay, there's the musculoskeletal, and then there's, the energetic body. And, so, I mean, we can go into much more depth um, besides musculoskeletal, but a lot of people just are like, hey, I can't be on the trampoline with my kids anymore, help me. And they think it's because of tightness.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, the second question was about the kind of the physical structure, but as you're speaking of that, um, that it is not an island unto itself. That's probably a bad metaphor, but a really bad one. But it is also, is it not, not just not an island, but a connection point, like a key connection point in the body to all the other parts of the body. So if you're talking about the structure, can you talk about the function a little bit like that?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I know that in all the anatomy books that it's shown as a hammock or sling, but there was an MRI study done on it that showed that it's more dynamic than that. So it has like almost a tiny little dome shape. So if you think about a hammock, a hammock you just like sink into, right? And so that's really not the kind of image you want with your pelvic floor. You want your pelvic floor to be dynamically responding to the task at hand. So I kind of like the idea of a trampoline, going back to that trampoline idea, is that, if I'm jumping up and down, I want my pelvic floor to be going with me instead of just down. Right?
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, so I like to think of it more like trampoline, or even a slight dome. The study actually said, those were the words in the study, the pelvic floor is a dome. It's a very small dome, but it's not a sling.
right.
So starting with that, okay, so that's an interesting thing. And I think just when you're visualizing it on your own body, to think of it in this more dynamic um, way. Okay, and then as far as it's the gateway between your lower body and your upper body. I mean, it's, like there's your legs, whatever you're doing with your legs is going through the pelvic floor. I like to think of it as like the transmission station, right? It's like what you just did with your left foot. Well, guess what? It had to go through the pelvic floor and then be reoriented up the body. So, when I see pelvic floor issues, let's say somebody's coming to me, and again, I'll just make this up, left side of the pelvic floor is overly tight, not working. Well, what do I find? Often their left leg isn't working very well. Like they're not aware that when they're getting out of the chair that they're only using their right leg. They're kind of like leaning to one side as they're getting up, and like think about how many times we get up and down off the floor of the chair or our car or whatever. Something as simple as that can, strengthening the left leg and getting it to like, be an equal partner with the right can help the pelvic floor, right? So helping the pelvic floor, we can do it more microscopically, meaning we're just working with the pelvic floor. And that is a good thing to do because that also kind of telegraphs through the body up and down. But anything that's happening above the pelvic floor or below the pelvic floor is going to reflect through the pelvic floor. So I see a lot of people that have restriction in their respiratory diaphragm, for example, and they feel like, God, I can't take a deep breath. And I say, well, where's the tightness? And they can feel it sided. And that invariably is the tighter side of their pelvic floor. So if we get that side of the pelvic floor to release, often the respiratory diaphragm releases more, and getting the respiratory diaphragm to release on that side, and then your pelvic floor gets more movement. So again, this dynamism that is our body, it's like there's a constant conversation going on between, all the layers. But I mean, I see people with, TMJ and clenching at night. They've got their mouth guard thing they're telling me about, and their pelvic floor is all locked up.
Yeah.
Well, if you do some mouth work, craniosacral mouth work is amazing. You can release a lot of this tissue, and all of this tissue reflects into the pelvic floor.
So
So
connected.
it's all connected. It really is. It truly is.
As you're speaking, I've heard that here's the dome of your pelvic floor and here's the dome of your respiratory diaphragm, that when your diaphragm descends, your pelvic floor receives. And
It receives and it descends as well. And then when the suction of the lungs is pulling the respiratory diaphragm up, the pelvic floor should be helping dynamically to say, okay, we're going back up. Okay, you're coming down. I need to stretch a little bit to receive that movement. Oh, you need to be pulled up. Let me help lift up.
so
But
really,
another thing, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
just going to say, so really it's connected to breathing.
Hugely.
And there's the anchors of the core canister, if you go in the traditional sense. Now, if you go with the myofascial sling of the deep front line of Tom Myers chain, you're starting with your feet and you're getting to the base of the tongue.
Yep.
Can you put the pelvic floor into that sling? Is that like a essay
Absolutely.
question on your
Absolutely. If you spend 5 minutes on one foot, meaning you're massaging it, you're stretching your toes out, you're putting stuff between your toes, like if you spend 5 minutes like rolling on a ball, trying to pick up the ball, you will be amazed if you just do that and then stand up. You'll feel like that whole side that you just did is like so open. So you can release the pelvic floor from the feet, you can release the pelvic floor from the mouth, and you can release the pelvic floor from the pelvic floor.
And as a part of the core, what's the role? I know it's the anchor. How does it play? Does it play nicely with others? Does it?
I'm pausing because anchor. I'm not liking that.
Well, it's not if you're
talking because again, the image of I have an anchor, it's like it's like down on the bottom of the sea anchor. That's,
Yeah.
and so again, I want more dynamism in that description. So I love words. So let me think of a better word than anchor, but it is the beginning. I actually teach, like, if you think about, if you just close your eyes for a moment, watch your inhale. A lot of us feel, okay, my chest expanded, maybe my belly expanded. But with pelvic floor, if you can imagine that on your inhalation, the first place that your inhale touches is your pelvic floor, and that the inhale is coming from the pelvic floor to the chest. That is a very different image than, we all are teaching diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing, but again, words matter. If someone thinks they're supposed to be belly breathing, they're gonna mostly think of their lower belly. They're gonna be thinking it should go in and out like this, and it should, but your pelvic floor should also be going up and down with the breath. So yes, so the breath is paramount to the health of the pelvic floor. And what I see a lot, I'm going to go with 98% of the time. If someone has pelvic pain, they are reverse breathing. So you just showed with your hands, okay, pelvic floor, respiratory diaphragm, inhale, exhale. But if you're a reverse breather, you're inhaling, this is getting pushed down, and your pelvic floor is lifting up. So you're pulling your belly in and up with every exhale. And, we breathe what, 15,000 times a day if we're lucky. So, like, that's a lot of tightening. And so it's teaching people that that's wrong is a huge job.
Now, how can you do that in a yoga practice? So what can yoga bring to this uh,
This conundrum.
holistic picture?
Well, yoga done in a thoughtful way, meaning intentionally. I know there's a lot of yoga out there with Van Morrison playing in the background, and that's all good, but that's not about going inward and, feeling really getting embodied and feeling the subtlety of things. So, very simply, when we're doing a yoga pose where the legs have to roll out, that affects the pelvic floor by narrowing it. So if you roll your thigh bones out, your sitting bones narrow. So then the pelvic floor is a little more narrow. If you roll your thighs in a pose, you're widening your sitting bones, the pelvic floor is stretching. So just like, that's just a simple example, but there's multiple examples of how we're working the foot. Are you on the inner foot, the outer foot? Are you lifting your knees or you're not? Are you bending your knees in the straight leg pose, like downward dog? A lot of people, I would say, if they're working on their pelvic floor because it's tight, they shouldn't have straight leg down dog, because it's going to pull their lower back into flexion and their pelvis into posterior, and then they're not getting to their pelvic floor because their hamstrings have hijacked their pelvis.
How interesting.
Yeah. So things like that. So, is this a pose where my pelvis should be more tucked, or is this a pose where my pelvis should be more untucked? And all of that affects the pelvic floor muscles. So again, generally, so I gave you internal, external rotation. If you're tucking your pelvis, posterior tilt, that the tail's moving towards the pubic bone, you're shortening the pelvic floor. If you're doing a forward fold where you're supposed to untuck, legs roll in, that's a stretch for the pelvic floor. But hamstrings are a huge, huge problem for the pelvic floor. So if there's tightness of the pelvic floor and your hamstrings are tight, it's very hard to stretch your pelvic floor with straight legs. So, just again, little nuancy things that can help you access and help whatever your issue is. And let me just go back to the beginning of this conversation. Everybody needs a strong pelvic floor. And yes, most people's pelvic floor is on the weak side, but is it weak loose or is it weak tight? And you know what? Both of those pelvic floors need the same strengthening exercises, but people that start out with a tight pelvic floor need a little more attention and nuance and stretching and releasing
Before they do the
before and during, because what I see, like a lot of, I talk to my physical therapist friends, about this, my pelvic floor physical therapist. And a lot of them are teaching just strengthening. And I say, that does work for a lot of people to just go to strengthening, even if it's tight. But for some people, it doesn't. So, like a condition like vulvodynia, where you have pain, that doing the strengthening exercises might make it worse because some people are clenching. They're in this really hyper vigilant nervous system, so that they're like constantly ready to like flee. What is it? Fight or flight, right? So they're constantly embracing. So then they're bracing and then they're being taught Kegels. And it's like, that's just making things worse.
Yeah.
So it's really individual. And this is, the beauty of yoga is, you can really tailor a practice for what each person has going on. And it's also the challenge of teaching group classes because, if I've got people who are lax in their pelvic floor and tight, so it gets a little tricky. But
Leslie, do you think people know what they have? Do you think people who have,
um
you think people
mm,
who are coming to see you because they know they have some dysfunction?
yeah, they come for dysfunction. I would say if they're having incontinence, they generally think they're loose, and that's often not the case. You can have incontinence because of tightness. With pain, I'm gonna say there is a lot more awareness of pain being a clenching pelvic floor, a tight pelvic floor, but not always. People are like, "Oh my God, I never thought my pain would be because I'm clenching." But when you just talk to them about it, they're like, "Oh yeah, that totally makes sense." But we don't talk about it enough. You know, Again, it's changing. Doctors have better awareness. I mean, I know a lot of medical programs in the United States now are asking gynecologists to work a couple weeks with pelvic floor PTs. Because believe it or not, until very, very recently, a gynecologist was not trained like a PT is about pelvic muscle health. So,
And pelvic
poke.
floor PT is a real specialization, right? It's not uh
Yeah. So yeah, they've gone to PT school, and then there's an additional training that they have to do internal work. Yeah.
so our community, our Yoga U community eats stuff like this. We love the didactic, we love the
Yeah.
theory, but what we really love is how can we put this into practice? And luckily, you are going to be teaching a 7-part series for us, which is live interactive practices with you, where you're going from the feet up. In fact, it's called Pelvic Floor Health from the Ground Up. So, can you talk a little bit about that? Kind of, don't give us a blow by blow, but what can we expect and who can take this class? Is this for everybody?
The class is for
Well,
everybody.
don't have pelvic floor issues should be taking a pelvic
See
floor
if
awareness.
there's interest. You may not even know you have a pelvic floor, or like me, I had one brewing, but I didn't know it until it was a problem. Had I taken my own workshop, that would have been helpful. So the workshops for everybody, all genders. The great thing about the pelvic floor is the musculature in all bodies is very similar. So, all the cueing would be exactly the same for whatever pelvis you have. So there's that. I'm calling it from the ground up because the feet, as I was saying earlier in this talk, the feet are so important to pelvic floor health. So, think of all the things we do with our feet: standing, walking, running, our feet, we unfortunately, I know yogis are a little bit better about going barefoot, but they're in shoes. They're in these shoes, like our toes are, going all different which
Yeah,
ways. The more articulation you can get in your foot, the better your pelvic floor will be. So from the feet, and then we're going to go to the knees, and then to the hips, and like all the surrounding tissue of the hips. Then we're going to look at our, how the core and the pelvic floor work together. Yeah. And we'll also look at the energy body, and, we'll work with some mudras and our breathing. So, yeah. So
really is an integrating connector or hub. What did you call it? You called it a transmission
transmission station.
station, but really it's a central communication and integrate.
Yeah, it's like if you think about the old movies where you would see the switching stations of the trains, where they're switching the trains coming this way, all of a sudden they switches the train goes. It's kind of like that. Like yoga, I feel like yoga is doing that. It's like, no, I want the energy to go here.
Yeah.
It's not going here. I want it to go here. So that, and this is the beauty of yoga practice, is being
And,
able.
and the practices you're doing are not esoteric, exotic. It's you're working with regular practice, right? You're not doing, now
I like to say I'm a practical yogi. I'm very, so like if someone can't find their feet, then me asking them to find their energy body is probably not a great thing. But that said, I am going to talk about the energy body in one or two of these classes. They won't be like all that, but I think for your folks that have a practice, that have a level of subtlety, and even people that don't, to just hear it and to aspire to feel some of these things. I mean, I can remember my teacher. My teacher's Ramanan Patel. He's amazing. He's like the deepest teacher I've ever studied with. He would say things 25 years ago, and I'd be like, whatever. I don't know what he's talking about, like this subtle thing. And now, I'm like, oh my God, like I feel that now. Like
yeah.
it's there. Like I totally get what he was talking about, So, sometimes I look at him and he gives an instruction. I say, that's like a 5-year instruction, or is that like a 20-year instruction?
That's funny. But I think the energy body thing is, I don't think of that as being super esoteric, because I think
Okay.
it's a really freeing notion for people that they have other aspects to them. It's kind of going back to the koshas, where you have different parts of the same person. No, I was really talking about poses that might be scary to do.
Oh, no, 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 no. No. I'm at an age where I don't do scary poses anymore. So I wouldn't ask that of my students either.
Oh, and something, it's very comfortable to talk to you about a topic that for a lot of people, it's a vulnerable place, it's a scary place, it's a not too familiar place. So I think you have a real knack of making it less scary, uncomfortable, awkward.
Thank
Um,
you.
so
Thank you.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to your course. I know our YogaU Sangha is also going to enjoy this. So we will see you in class. Thank you for a really fun interview.
I look forward to it.
Bye-bye, everyone.